If it comes at all, it will be here by the 2 o'clock delivery. I shall leave the city about that time, and walk to Charing Cross, on the left-hand side of the way. If there are any letters, come and meet me, and bring them with you.' Noggs nodded, and as he nodded there came a ring at the office bell. The master looked up from his papers, and the clerk calmly remained in a stationary position. 'The bell,' said Noggs, as though in explanation. 'At home?' 'Yes.' 'To anybody?' 'Yes.' 'To the tax gatherer?' 'No. Let him call again.' Noggs gave vent to his usual grunt, as much as to say, 'I thought so,' and, the ring being repeated, went to the door, whence he presently returned, ushering in, by the name of Mr. Bonney, a pale gentleman in a violent hurry, who, with his hair standing up in great disorder all over his head, and a very narrow white cravat tied loosely round his throat, looked as if he had been knocked up in the night, and had not dressed himself since. 'My dear Nickleby,' said the gentleman, taking off a white hat, which was so full of papers that it would scarcely stick upon his head, 'there's not a moment to lose. I have a cab at the door. Sir Matthew Pupker takes the chair, and 3 members of Parliament are positively coming. I have seen 2 of them safely out of bed. The third, who was at Crockford's all night, has just gone home to put a clean shirt on and take a bottle or 2 of soda water, and will certainly be with us in time to address the meeting. He's a little excited by last night, but never mind that. He always speaks the stronger for it.' 'It seems to promise pretty well,' said Mr. Ralph Nickleby, whose deliberate manner was strongly opposed to the vivacity of the other man of business. 'Pretty well,' echoed Mr. Bonney. 'It's the finest idea that was ever started. United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Capital 5 millions in 500,000 shares of £10 each. Why, the very name will get the shares up to a premium in 10 days. And when they are at a premium,' said Mr. Ralph Nickleby, smiling, 'when they are, you know what to do with them as well as any man alive, and how to back quietly out at the right time,' said Mr. Bonney, slapping the capitalist familiarly on the shoulder. 'By the bye, what a very remarkable man that clerk of yours is.' 'Yes, poor devil,' replied Ralph, drawing on his gloves, 'though Newman Noggs kept his horses and hounds once.' 'Ay, ay?' said the other carelessly. 'Yes,' continued Ralph, 'and not many years ago either. But he squandered his money, invested it anyhow, borrowed at interest, and, in short, made first a thorough fool of himself, and then a beggar. He took to drinking, and had a touch of paralysis, and then came here to borrow £1, as in his better days I'd—' 'Done business with him?' said Mr. Bonney, with a meaning look. 'Just so,' replied Ralph. 'I couldn't lend it, you know.' 'Oh, of course not.' 'But as I wanted a clerk just then, to open the door and so forth, I took him out of charity, and he's remained with me ever since. He's a little mad, I think,' said Mr. Nickleby, calling up a charitable look, 'but he's useful enough, poor creature, useful enough.' The kind-hearted gentleman omitted to add that Newman Noggs, being utterly destitute, served him for rather less than the usual wages of a boy of 13, and likewise failed to mention, in his hasty chronicle, that his eccentric taciturnity rendered him an especially valuable person in a place where much business was done of which it was desirable no mention should be made out of doors. The other gentleman was plainly impatient to be gone, however, and as they hurried into the hackney cabriolet immediately afterwards, perhaps Mr. Nickleby forgot to mention circumstances so unimportant. There was a great bustle in Bishopsgate Street within, as they drew up, and, it being a windy day, half a dozen men were tacking across the road under a press of paper, bearing gigantic announcements that a public meeting would be holden at 1 o'clock precisely, to take into consideration the propriety of petitioning Parliament in favour of the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company, capital 5 millions, in 500,000 shares of £10 each, which sums were duly set forth in fat black figures of considerable size. Mr. Bonney elbowed his way briskly upstairs, receiving in his progress many low bows from the waiters who stood on the landings to show the way, and, followed by Mr. Nickleby, dived into a suite of apartments behind the great public room, in the second of which was a business-looking table, and several business-looking people. "Here!" cried a gentleman with a double chin, as Mr. Bonney presented himself. "Chair, gentlemen, chair!" The newcomers were received with universal approbation, and Mr. Bonney bustled up to the top of the table, took off his hat, ran his fingers through his hair, and knocked a hackney coachman's knock on the table with a little hammer, whereat several gentlemen cried "Hear!" and nodded slightly to each other, as much as to say what spirited conduct that was. Just at this moment a waiter, feverish with agitation, tore into the room, and throwing the door open with a crash, shouted, "Sir Matthew Pupker!" The committee stood up and clapped their hands for joy, and while they were clapping them, in came Sir Matthew Pupker, attended by two live members of Parliament, one Irish and one Scotch, all smiling and bowing, and looking so pleasant that it seemed a perfect marvel how any man could have the heart to vote against them. Sir Matthew Pupker especially, who had a little round head with a flaxen wig on the top of it, fell into such a paroxysm of bows that the wig threatened to be jerked off every instant. When these symptoms had in some degree subsided, the gentlemen who were on speaking terms with Sir Matthew Pupker, or the two other members, crowded round them in three little groups, near one or other of which the gentlemen who were not on speaking terms with Sir Matthew Pupker, or the two other members, stood lingering and smiling and rubbing their hands, in the desperate hope of something turning up which might bring them into notice. All this time Sir Matthew Pupker and the two other members were relating to their separate circles what the intentions of Government were about taking up the bill, with a full account of what the Government had said in a whisper the last time they dined with it, and how the Government had been observed to wink when it said so, from which premises they were at no loss to draw the conclusion that if the Government had one object more at heart than another, that one object was the welfare and advantage of the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Meanwhile, and pending the arrangement of the proceedings and a fair division of the speechifying, the public in the large room were eyeing by turns the empty platform and the ladies in the music gallery. In these amusements the greater portion of them had been occupied for a couple of hours before, and as the most agreeable diversions pall upon the taste on a too protracted enjoyment of them, the sterner spirits now began to hammer the floor with their boot heels, and to express their dissatisfaction by various hoots and cries. These vocal exertions, emanating from the people who had been there longest, naturally proceeded from those who were nearest to the platform, and furthest from the policemen in attendance, who, having no great mind to fight their way through the crowd, but entertaining nevertheless a praiseworthy desire to do something to quell the disturbance, immediately began to drag forth by the coat-tails and collars all the quiet people near the door, at the same time dealing out various smart and tingling blows with their truncheons, after the manner of that ingenious actor Mr. Punch, whose brilliant example both in the fashion of his weapons and their use, this branch of the executive occasionally follows. Several very exciting skirmishes were in progress, when a loud shout attracted the attention even of the belligerents, and then there poured on to the platform, from a door at the side, a long line of gentlemen with their hats off, all looking behind them, and uttering vociferous cheers, the cause whereof was sufficiently explained when Sir Matthew Pupker and the two other real members of Parliament came to the front, amidst deafening shouts, and testified to each other in dumb motions that they had never seen such a glorious sight as that in the whole course of their public career. At length, and at last, the assembly left off shouting, but Sir Matthew Pupker being voted into the chair, they underwent a relapse which lasted 5 minutes. This over, Sir Matthew Pupker went on to say what must be his feelings on that great occasion, and what must be that occasion in the eyes of the world, and what must be the intelligence of his fellow countrymen before him, and what must be the wealth and respectability of his honourable friends behind him, and lastly, what must be the importance to the wealth, the happiness, the comfort, the liberty, the very existence of a free and great people, of such an institution as the